The story of Elijah and his devoted prophet in training, Elisha, is a good story. And like any good story, it has multiple layers to it, making it a story not just for one group of people, but for all people, including lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. Today's portion of the Elijah-Elisha story takes place during troubled times. You see, once upon a time, long before our story picks up, God had guided the rulers of Israel. There had once been a time when justice had prevailed, a day when righteousness and peace had kissed each other, as the psalmist wrote. But those times had long passed. Rulers had abandoned God and God's ways, and they sat upon their throne only for power and self-gain. But there are always those who speak against misused political and religious power, shouting their truth into the roar of the wind and the blast of the fiery furnace. If you want to hear what they have to say, you have to listen closely, because their voices are all but drowned out by the mainstream opinion. They are the prophets of God whose message is one of truth against power. Prophets don't turn away from injustice. They don't close their eyes to oppression. They speak out their truth regardless of the consequences. That's just the sort of prophet that Elijah was. He was a truth-speaking, in-your-face voice of God. He had spent a lot of his career denouncing the greedy power structure of his day, and the rest of his career on the run from those same power structures. But his career was coming to an end. And that's where our reading picks up. It picks up at the end of his days. It picks up with God calling him away from the city of Bethel, past the fortressed walls of Jericho, across the Jordan River, and into the wilderness. Why the wilderness, we ask? Because that's where God takes those who are called to be leaders and teachers and disciples and activists and people who are willing to live authentically. The wilderness is where we remember the one in whom we live and move and have our being. It's where God trains us and fashions us into survivors, because if you can survive the wilderness, you can survive anything. It's where we learn and relearn the lesson that God will provide us with everything we need, with all the resources and all the strength to rise above despair. It's where people are transformed from everyday people into what Richard Ward calls wilderness people. Wilderness people, he says, recognize that they are not close to the centers of power where influence is peddled, where commodities are exchanged, and where decisions are made that affect the future. But, he says, there are those who are close to those centers of power who are already writing drafts of our obituaries. And the temptation for us wilderness people is to believe those who write our obituaries. Elijah had seen his share of wildernesses in his lifetime and read his own obituary many times over. And so he was almost comfortable with the idea of one more wilderness before being taken home to an eternity with God. But he wasn't so sure about his disciple Elisha. In our text, Elisha tries to protect his follower from the pain and loneliness of the wilderness. He tells him to stay behind, but Elisha, refusing to abandon his mentor, stuck to him like a shadow. And so the two of them walked on until at last they crossed the Jordan River and entered the wilderness together. And it was there that Elijah asked Elisha, what was it that he wanted? And Elisha responded by saying, I want to be like you. I want to be a prophet. I want to speak truth in the face of power. Now, no matter what you've been told, prophets aren't people who go around predicting the future. Ward gives us a good description of prophets when he tells us they find themselves on the margins of political and religious power because of what they have committed themselves to, because of their vision of what God is up to in the world. Prophets sense that something isn't quite right with the status quo. They have a way of speaking about and on behalf of those who are suffering. Prophets refuse to believe the present reality is all the reality there is. They maintain a healthy skepticism about the ability of any government. But prophets refuse to give in to despair, instead fashioning a word of relentless hope in the face of oppression and exploitation. And prophets come together for mutual support, to share their visions and wisdom, and to encourage one another. I believe you and I are prophets. I believe we have been called for just such a time as this, called to speak out against the violence that is sweeping our land like the flames that devour a dry forest, called to proclaim God's love for all people, and called to embody that proclamation as we live and love authentically and proudly. I believe we stand on the margins of religion and politics, but I believe Jesus stands with us. I believe we have spent a lot of time in the wilderness learning how to fight for our rights and march proudly and beat the drums of liberty and justice for all. And I believe Metropolitan Community Churches was called into being by God to be the voice of inclusion and the spirit of radical love. I believe the world is literally dying to hear our message. And for anyone who is willing to take up that call of inclusion and love, I believe you are prophets. Our story says that the time came when suddenly a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared, and Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. But he left something behind. He left his cloak. And when Elisha picked up the cloak, he was granted his heart's desire. He became a prophet. But did he snatch it from the ground? Or did he have to think about it? Ward imagines the sorts of questions that might have run through Elisha's mind before taking up the cloak. Did he wonder if he was ready? Did he wonder if he had enough time to prepare? Had he paid close enough attention to what his mentor told him during the time they had together? Did he wonder if the same power that was so evident in the life of his mentor, his teacher, his counselor would be present with him? What did it cost him to pick it up? He could no longer hide in the wings holding Elijah's coat. He could no longer depend on Elijah to speak for him. He could no longer expect Elijah to act if he was too afraid. But you see, God wasn't calling a second Elijah. God was calling Elisha. And the people didn't need a photocopy of his teacher. They needed him, Elisha. They needed his own unique vision and his own voice, not some warmed over version of his mentor. Elijah was right for his time. Now it was time for Elisha. We LGBT folk have had our share of prophets who have taken up the cloak that was dropped on the ground before them. Bayard Rustin, Harvey Milk, Malcolm Boyd, Peter Gomes, Troy Perry, David Cato, Gene Robinson, Nancy Wilson, Mel White. Each of them have fearlessly spoken the truth of God's radically inclusive love, which encompasses lesbians, gay men, bisexuals, and transgenders, and each of them have paid the price for it. But now it's our turn. God has dropped a cloak at our feet. And the question for you and me today is, how long will it take us to pick it up? May we respond to God's call to be prophets. And may our responses be an emphatic, yes, God, here am I. Send me. Use me. Amen.